Okay, hello, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this oral session. Oops, okay. All right. So today I'd like to talk to you about exploration-exploitation trade-offs. They are something that we encounter in everyday life. Imagine you're here in Singapore for the first time and you find yourself in a hawker center and you have to decide what to eat. You could decide to pick something that you've had before that you might be very familiar with, let's say chicken satay. You pretty much know what you're going to get and you can be pretty certain how much you're going to like it. Or you could decide to explore some of the many intriguing local foods that we have here. And you might find something that you really like and you're going to be happy that you tried something new. Or you may also land on this durian here, and depending on your preferences and with regards to its odor, you may not be so happy that you choose it, and you may have wished that instead you exploited and stuck with the safe option. Exploration-exploitation trade-offs don't just apply to mundane decisions such as this, but have been shown to be important for survival across species, from the single-celled organisms to insects to even to mammals. And also it can be applied to complex dynamic environments such as investing in the stock market. A key system that has been implicated in exploration-exploitation is the noradrenergic arousal system, with projections originating from the locus coeruleus and emanating throughout the brain. Adaptive game theory links arousal, noradrenaline, and exploration, and was formulated after the observation in macaque monkeys that there is a curvilinear relationship between tonic locus coeruleus activity and task performance on a target detection task. What they noticed was that when locus coeruleus shows phasic bursts of activity after the target, the monkeys were very task engaged and tended to exploit more. And when locus coeruleus showed sustained tonic increases of activities, the monkeys were more distractible and tended to be more open to exploration. A key part of adaptive game theory is that these changes in exploration are not just related to endogenous fluctuations in arousal, but instead are triggered by changes in the context or environment in terms of utility. And the idea here is that areas such as anterior cingulate are tracking the utility in the environment and communicating this information to locus coeruleus. And as the utility or value in the environment drops, this is potentially when locus coeruleus shifts more into a tonic phase, and monkeys are more open to exploration because it's more beneficial to seek out better options when the values are low. In addition, adaptive game theory posits that utility needs to be low over longer time scales, potentially minutes, in order for task engagement to drop and locus coeruleus to change its activity pattern. So in the current study, what we sought to do was test some of the key predictions that fall out of adaptive game theory by looking at this in humans. We wanted to test the main prediction that baseline arousal should be increased prior to exploration, not just for the current choice, but also over a longer time period and for several choices leading up to exploration. We also expected that we would see similar sustained activity increases in regions that are related to exploration in the brain. Because anterior cingulate is known to have a role in regulating between exploration and exploitation, we also predicted that any changes that we see in baseline arousal for explore versus exploit would also be mirrored by neural activity changes in anterior cingulate. And finally, we wanted to test whether these changes that we would see in baseline arousal and neural activity for exploration relative to exploration is related to more optimal or adaptive decision making. So we did this by using a classic restless bandit task, which is usually used to elicit exploratory choices. And the idea is that the subjects are seeing virtual slot machines indicated by these squares here. And the slot machines pay out rewards in terms of points that are drifting randomly over the course of the trials. And the idea is that the participants can learn these reward values, and they have to identify the highest paying option, but occasionally they have to sample the other options in order to explore and identify the slot machines that are increasing in value. We modeled how these participants learn these values using a standard reinforcement learning model that's been previously published, and we used these to classify the choice type. So when participants chose the highest paying option based on their own estimates, we considered this exploitation, and when they chose an option that they didn't think was the highest paying, we considered this an exploratory choice. We did this task with 66 participants in the fMRI scanner, and we also collected simultaneous eye tracking data. From the eye tracking data, we took pupil diameter estimates and we locked them to the trial onset. And then we extracted the time series 2 seconds prior to the trial onset, going all the way up to 5 seconds post-trial. And critically, pupil diameter has been shown to be indexing of fluctuations in locus coeruleus firing. And so we use this as our measure of arousal in humans. So to our first prediction that baseline arousal will be increased prior to exploration before the current choice, when we look at the time series that we extract for explore relative to exploit, we can see here the 0 mark is the onset of the trial, and in red we see the pupil diameter for explore choices relative to exploit in green. And we can see, in fact, that the pupil diameter is increased, and this already occurs prior to the trial onset. For all the subsequent analyses, we took the 1 second window prior to the onset of the trial and took the average pupil diameter here, and we considered this our measure of pupil baseline. The relationship between pupil baseline and probability to explore was still significant even when we controlled for decision variables that are known to be relevant to exploration. When we went to our second question, is this a sustained increase in pupil baseline arousal? We looked at the current trial, but we also looked at trials going up to 6 trials before exploration. And as you can see here, again, plotted in the red, the pupil baseline shows a steady increase leading up to exploration that we don't see for exploit trials. You might think this is maybe due to some kind of autocorrelation in the behavioral pattern, that when subjects explore, they're more likely to explore on the trial before. But in fact, when we look at the fraction of exploration prior to an exploratory trial, participants are more likely to exploit. So this increase in pupil baseline potentially reflects some kind of accumulation of evidence in favor of switching and is not necessarily tied to the actual choice. In line with adaptive game theory, we also noticed that the utility is depressed prior to an exploratory trial. So here we're plotting the relative value of the highest paying option, which is lower leading up to explore trials rather than exploit, suggesting that this may be a reason why participants are more seeking out better options. To our second prediction, looking at neural activity increases, for the current trial, we replicate previous findings showing that frontal polar cortex, anterior cingulate, and inferior parietal lobular increase for explore relative to exploit choices. And when we go one trial back, we find that frontal polar cortex is the region that is showing similar sustained activity increases, even though participants are exploiting on these previous trials. Going to our second prediction, looking at the anterior cingulate, when we look at neural activity increases in anterior cingulate for explore versus exploit, the region in yellow shows that the larger increases for exploration-related activity are linked to larger increases in pupil baseline for explore relative to exploit. And finally, going to our last prediction, do these increases in pupil baseline as well as neural activity actually reflect something adaptive or optimal about the decision making? So when we take the same average measure of pupil baseline for explore relative to exploit and we relate that to task performance across participants, we do in fact find a correlation between pupil baseline and how optimal the participants are in terms of the percentage of points that they earn on the task. And when we look at whole brain neural activity, the regions in yellow are regions where increases in activity for exploration are linked to more optimal performance. So again, we can see anterior cingulate is a region that seems to be related to better performance on the task. And the region in yellow nicely overlaps with what we see, the region in anterior cingulate that is also linked to changes in arousal. So just to summarize what we've seen so far, we find that there's an increase in pupil diameter prior to exploratory choices relative to exploit, and that this increase happens over a sustained period of time prior to exploration, even though participants are exploiting. So we provide some novel evidence for some of the central predictions of adaptive game theory. We also show that frontal polar cortex potentially is increased prior to exploration and potentially has a long-term role in accumulating evidence in favor of a behavioral switch, which has been shown before, but only for the current trial. So we're showing a little bit of a longer time scale for this. And in addition, we show that the larger the activity increases for anterior cingulate for exploration, the larger the increases in baseline arousal, and this potentially demonstrates the importance of interactions between locus coeruleus, noradrenaline, and anterior cingulate in initiating exploration. And finally, we show that the more sensitive both the baseline arousal is to differentiating exploration and exploitation and the neural activity is, the more optimal the participants are on the task. So potentially this promotes improved behavioral flexibility. So I'd like to thank all my collaborators on this work, as well as our sources of funding. And I'd like to thank you for your attention.